Member for Nepean Carleton.
Thanks very much, Mr. Speaker. Real pleasure to be able today to speak about bullying once again before this chamber rises for the summer intersession. Before I begin, I would like to thank a few people for their dedication. I may not always agree, but there are many people who really believe that we need action on anti-bullying legislation. And they came to Queen's Park, and many of them sit in this chamber. In particular, I would like to say thank you to those members on the Social Policy Standing Committee. Although I'm not a member, I was subbed into that committee during clause-by-clause delegations. And although we may not agree, as I've stated many times, Speaker, on everything, I must say to my colleague Peter Tabbins and to Sherry DeNovo from the NDP, they were a pleasure to work with. My colleague, the parliamentary assistant to the Minister of Education, Bob Delaney, as well as Tracy McCharles and Deepika Demirla, and finally Donna Cansfield, sat through committee hearings with my colleagues, Jane McKenna, Ernie Hardiman, and John Yakubuski. A day didn't go by at those hearings that we didn't hear from the public, and we didn't hear stories that would take your breath away. Some of those stories, Speaker, I'll recount later today, but I wanted to first start by saying thank you to my colleagues. Secondly, I'd like to say thank you to the former member of Kitchener-Waterloo, Elizabeth Whitmer. I would like to tell a little bit of a story. After the election, I was appointed education critic in the official opposition. Within a few days, I had an email from Elizabeth Whitmer letting me know that she had planned on introducing legislation she'd been working on for 3 years. She knew that this was going to be important to me because I had already publicly spoken in my local community newspapers as a result of high-profile suicide in my community, which I've spoken about several times in this chamber. When she pointed that out to me, I would suggest that would have been late October, very early November. I also received an email from my colleague from Burlington, Jane McKenna, who has her own long history of confronting bullying with her son. As a brand new member, she had asked if she could put forward anti-bullying legislation. As a caucus speaker, you'll know, history speaks for itself. The Ontario PC caucus chose to move forward with Bill 14. After 3 years of labour and toiling on the best approach to move forward, the Ontario PC caucus settled on Mrs. Whitmer's piece of legislation. At the time, and we still do believe, Speaker, that it was the toughest piece of anti-bullying legislation ever tabled in this legislature. We believe that it was the cornerstone of protection for all Ontario students. I mentioned to you about the high-profile suicide in my community. But a week and a half after I was re-elected to this chamber for the third time, one of my friends, long-time friends, lost his son. It was a Friday night. I generally wake a little bit early on a Saturday. I've got a 7-year-old, I've got 2 very yappy dogs, and I've got a cat that all bargain for my attention when I'm home. About 7:30, 8 o'clock, that Saturday morning, I received a very simple email from Alan Hubley, who said the evening before he had lost his beautiful boy. Before that hit the media and became a front-page story across the world, my friend and his wife had to grapple with the reality that not only had their son grappled with mental illness for a very long period of time, he'd also been bullied his entire life for a variety of reasons. Most recently, of course, because he was openly gay. And some kids in his class were homophobic. I went to Alan and Wendy's house that day. Alan and I both grew up in the Maritimes, Nova Scotia, both of us actually. little thing you do down there is you love your neighbor and you treat your neighbor the way you'd want to be treated yourself. And you often bring food. If there's any way to provide warmth or comfort to a friend, that's what you do, or to a family member. I popped by, and my friend and his wife Wendy were remarkably strong, very brave, probably in shock, and unlikely to know that not only would Jamie's passing affect them, but it would affect our province. A lot has been said about how to proceed with anti-bullying. And that's why I was pleased at the time that two pieces of legislation came to the floor of this Assembly under the titles of the Accepting Schools Act and the Anti-Bullying Act. I want to talk about this, Speaker, because until I think people are actually affected, whether it's your own child or it's someone you know's child, you don't really understand that bullying isn't what it used to be. One of our colleagues wrote an op-ed that sticks and stones may break your bones, but names will never hurt me. Well, we know that's not true. Life today is way different. And I like to say I might be one of the younger members of this Assembly, but Mr. Speaker, times have changed. And that's why we have to have this very full discussion. Now, getting back to Bill 14, Elizabeth Whitmer's bill. I've thought a lot about how we could proceed on this as Education Critic. And that's why, as a member of the Parliamentary Liaison Working Group, my colleague Christine Elliott, Jim Wilson, and Randy Hillier offered up a solution we felt was the best way to approach this. And I believe we started in December and this culminated at the beginning of March, where we had tried to negotiate a way to bring these bills together before people took entrenched positions so that we could have a bill that people could unite behind, so that there could be one piece of legislation that would protect all kids at all times and ensure that the buck stops somewhere. Because, Speaker, if there has been one thing that we have heard in this chamber and at committee and in the public, it is that parents want somebody held accountable for when their child is tormented. That's why we had asked to go to committee immediately before second reading, continued on Bill 13. I needn't remind members that after the 1-hour lead-off that we had back in March, Bill 14 came to this chamber for private members' time under the member for Kitchener-Waterloo. I remember that day very clearly, Speaker. I spoke to the bill. I attended a press conference with the member from Kitchener-Waterloo, and I almost missed the day myself because it was the day that we found out our little Victoria had a brush with her own bully, and the school had called. And a side note, I must say it must have been very difficult for the teacher to make the call to the person who's been on the front page of the newspapers back home talking about anti-bullying. In this case, it was important that the parents were notified, my husband and I, and I'm confident that our school took the necessary precautions at our elementary school. They used a restorative justice in this particular case, and I feel as a parent that the situation is now not only under control, but we've moved past that. Which brings me to an issue that has bothered me since that day. That was something that we should have talked about, restorative practices. It led me to conclude that the process by which we followed this particular bill effectively has failed us all. As I mentioned, we had thought it would have been better to merge the two bills or have that discussion earlier on in the process. Failing that, I think we could have opted for something unique, something that's not been done in this chamber for perhaps the last 20 years. And that is asking a policy-directed field like a Committee on Social Policy to study an issue. Have meaningful public consultation at the beginning, using the two bills as a basis to move forward. Find out what we may have missed, and not confine ourselves to the rigid committee process that we have here. I think many people's opinions on anti-bullying legislation have evolved over the course of the last 9 months. I think had meaningful discussions taken place at the very outset, we wouldn't be here today, dealing with only one bill put forward by the government, the rejection of the opposition bill. I must say that many members of the public feel that their voices were ignored at committee. I sat through 5 days of public hearings. There were witnesses on the right and there were witnesses on the left. But there were 9 witnesses that I think spoke to us from the middle, maybe a few more. But I will say that at standing committee, when we heard from parents, students, and anti-bullying coalitions, there was opposition to a great deal of certain sections in Bill 13. Many people felt that legislating the name of one group of anti-bullying over others was divisive and problematic. As Conservatives, we've always been of the opinion that there needs to be less government intrusion, not more, in the lives of families. And we feel that this bill runs counter to that. This bill also goes counter to some of the advice that we receive from the people that this government says they want to help, namely parents whose kids have committed suicide. The bill goes directly against the advice of Mike Urey and Alan Hubley, fathers of 2 sons who took their own lives as a result of bullying. It goes against the advice of Anthony McLean, an anti-bullying advocate who appears on Dalton McGuinty's website. It also goes against all of the advice of the anti-bullying coalitions who appeared before a social policy committee. I plan on reading a little bit about what they told us very shortly, Speaker, but I think it's important to note that those with credibility who have been working in anti-bullying legislation for many years are quite concerned that if we do not get this right, we will have failed. I can't impress upon you enough, or this government, that the stakes are very high. To make matters worse, my colleague, Ms. McKenna, and I were disappointed on a number of occasions that all but one of our progressive Conservative amendments that would have brought Bill 14 into Bill 13 were rejected by the committee. The measures blocked include the popular and comprehensive definition of bullying that Bill 14 had, as well as the reporting, tracking, and investigating protocols parents called for in committee. Even the bill title, From Accepting Schools Act to the Anti-Bullying Act, was stopped, and that, Speaker, to us, was quite troubling. As I've said, we had wanted a bill that could be supported throughout our entire province. As I said, Speaker, these parents and anti-bullying activists appeared before committee. Many of them feel that their voice has not been heard. Therefore, Speaker, I am going to ensure it is. Although in mere hours from now this bill will pass, I want to make sure that these people have their views adequately on the record. I'd like to start with Mike Urey. Mike Urey, he describes himself the father of a child who killed himself 6 years ago after being bullied. He came home from school one day and he hung himself in the bedroom closet. Stephen was 13. He wasn't gay, he wasn't religious, he wasn't any of the other categories, he was just a kid. The schools did nothing at all to the people that tortured him. They weren't suspended, they weren't expelled, they were moved to a different school. Mike's son, Stephen, appeared in the movie, or the documentary, Bully. He tells us that over 65% of his 5,000 members are mothers or grandmothers between the ages of 30 and 55. He was concerned that bullies won't join clubs, so while the focus on clubs was made, it didn't really ring relevant to him. Says we're talking about kids killing themselves. For every one you hear about in the paper, I can name 4 or 5 other cases of children who've taken their lives that don't make the media because they don't want to talk to papers. Mike was one of them. Said to us, consider this when you're considering how you're going to write this law. It has to apply to everyone. It has to apply properly. You can't just wish things away by training them to think one way or the other. You have to have responsibility and you have to have a response. Mike says the requirement of accountability in Bill 14 will help that. As it stands now, Bill 13 won't improve the situation. One of the most heartbreaking presentations at committee was Mike's. Let me read to you why. And if I may ask every member in this chamber to contemplate on what I'm about to read to you. We tried everything a parent can do. We talked. We tried getting people's attention. None of it worked. Nothing. The last time, the most severe case of bullying in his case was in a school bathroom. They took a can of Axe body spray and set him on fire. They put the video on YouTube. It's still up there because it can't be taken down once it's spread. I can't tell you what it does to my family. He didn't see Bill 13, and he says it right here. I don't see Bill 13 changing that. He does say to us at the end of his presentation that his wife will never be the same. She couldn't appear at committee. Her voice couldn't be heard at committee. As much as he brought his own, her voice will never be heard at committee. But her voice is heard here right now. I've shared the story of Jamie. Now I'd like to read a little bit about what his father told us at committee. One of the items in Bill 13 that I like is the support for student-led initiatives. However, I feel the proposed language in the bill needs to be modified. I respectfully request that no groups be given special status by being named. To do so will only suggest certain children are more important than others, and I do not support the notion. I am here today to ask you to protect every child. He says most of the kids I described above would not be protected by Bill 13, but they would by Bill 14. He was speaking, of course, Speaker, of Jamie wanting to start a rainbow club, that he wanted all kids to be able to join, whether they were tall, short, had freckles, an accent, a disability, or different colored skin. And he found it troublesome that we had to specifically legislate a name. This is from somebody who has walked that long, terrible, terrible walk. Alan also suggests that, and I'm going to quote him, many statistics have been thrown around in this discussion, but the reality is without the reporting mechanisms outlined in Bill 14, we do not know how many cases of bullying actually occur. Even with the goodwill of all parties, we do not know where to focus scarce resources because we don't have the common denominator or trends. We can't defeat an enemy we can't clearly identify. This was an important motion put forward by my colleague and I at committee, that we ensure that there was appropriate tracking mechanisms and reporting mechanisms to ensure that the appropriate data was being taken and that it was put into the right hands. And that motion was defeated and watered down, and it does appear in a very watered down version. But we feel, and it's certainly clear in this presentation that Mr. Hubley agrees that the best way to find out what is exactly going on is to have one source of data. Many times throughout the committee, I heard this report or this statistic or this report. One was Statistics Canada, Toronto District School Board, EGAL had something. I'm not sure whose was right, but I can say this. There was an opportunity in this legislature to ensure that there was data that could have been validated in our schools to ensure that the appropriate level of protection was there for our students. I think that was a missed opportunity, Speaker, and I think that this is what has made Bill 13 weaker for it. Another individual who took my breath away, and she relayed this message twice at committee, was Lynn McIntyre. She was very nervous when she appeared before committee. Now, I want you to remember, the people that I think the people that stuck out to me weren't the people who were part of a slick advertising crowd or a big lobby group or some activist organization. The people who stuck out to me were the mums and dads who formed grassroots anti-bullying coalitions, who've struggled with this themselves, who found that there was no accountability and are trying to create a voice for themselves, their children, and for other kids like them. Lynn McIntyre was that type of a person. She didn't come here with speaking points that were going to get in the media. She wasn't media savvy. In fact, that's what I found most endearing about her. But she talked about those kids who had committed suicide or had taken their life by suicide for a variety of reasons. And she talked about her concern that the Liberal legislation would have created a perception of hierarchy of targets. Her words, not mine. She said, quote, "My fear is that my son will not be protected and other children will fall through the cracks." I'm going to read her story into this record. After 9 years of constant harassment, physical assaults, unbearable torment, and even threats on my son's life, he doesn't want to go to school anymore. Instead of learning, he spends his time in class listening to snickering and name-calling, and recently they rolled up pieces of paper and smashed them with a badminton racket off his face for an entire 1-hour class. Not once did the teacher lift his head or notice, and therefore they didn't stop. With multiple paper cuts all over his face, I'm sure it was the most humiliating and most painful experience. Every day, I get in my car to go to work, and I'm frustrated with myself because I spent the last hour begging him to go to school. The whole time, I was riddled with grief and guilt because I know I'm sending him back to more torment. How can any mother ask their child to go to school to be treated like an animal? I have little confidence that the people who are there to be responsible for his safety will do so. Every day I ask myself at work, and I wonder, what are they going to do to him now? Every day I wonder, when I get home, will I have my son? She certainly wasn't alone. She did not feel that Bill 13 provided adequate protection to her son's bullying experience. I found it particularly gripping, Speaker, because I think we should all, when we think about this particular presentation, put our feet in her shoes. We should all consider how the system is failing her right now as well. And we should all consider why we should be doing better. That's why the Ontario PC Caucus put forward a motion that would have increased supervision time by teachers so that there would be that accountability, so that there would be someone who was held accountable if this torment were to continue. And that's why I want to say thank you so much to the Guelph Anti-Bullying Coalition, and particularly to Lynn McIntyre. One of the more eloquent presentations at our committee came from Karen Seven. She appeared via telephone and spoke to the whole committee. She says, aggression between our students takes place because adults allow it. Whether it's a child's parent, their teacher, or a school administrator, the job of keeping our youth safe is ours. When my youngest was in grade 8, he found himself in a situation where the adults in control were either non-reactive or receptive to a situation that my son found himself at the receiving end of. He was bullied by the same 5 peers for 3 years. The reason this took place is because at that particular time, policy wasn't worth the paper it was written on. Policy was interpreted to protect our administrators, and the consequences chosen did not change the negative behavior toward of his aggressors. She said what time and time again all parents have said at this committee. There were no accountability mechanisms built in place prior to, nor are there any built-in accountability measures now. If it seems to me, Speaker, if the parents who appeared before committee, who have been up against the wall with their school boards and their schools for years, are telling us we've got a problem, this Assembly has got to do some listening. And we didn't. And if we're going to put forward a piece of legislation, we have to do exactly what Karen Seven said is wrong, that the policy must be worth the paper it is written on. And unfortunately, Speaker, what we heard time and again at committee, that is not the case. We need timeless legislation. We need legislation that will protect all children, and that is what Karen Seven had asked for. Now let me read to you a little bit more about what Karen Seven told us at committee. And a reminder that she is with the York Region Anti-Bullying Coalition, which she is actually the co-chair of and founded by, with her son, who endured this type of bullying. Quote, "My son was not identified as an LGBT youth, yet he was suicidal. What explicit protections will be built into this legislation to protect a child like him? Would a child like him have the same benefits? Is anyone suggesting that he was not at risk? He suffered terribly for 3 years, was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress." Speaker, kids in our school are being bullied, and they are being diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. That's unbelievable. PTSD is normally reserved for frontline police officers or fire officers, or for our military men and women. Can you imagine sending your child into a combat zone just by going into his local school? This is what this parent felt. In fact, she actually said, and let me quote you this, "I'm going to ask if anyone actually knows what it feels like to exist on a daily basis wondering if your child will take his life while you're at work, and what's even worse, as a parent, you kept sending him in to that battle zone without protection of any kind." She goes on, "Families like mine in this province are finding each other. This is taking place because so far the system has failed us miserably." She moves on and she says, "We are hard-working, tax-paying citizens who have the absolute right to be heard and not brushed off by our government. And by gosh, Speaker, because she was a supporter of Bill 14 and not Bill 13, she did not have her voice heard at committee." She says, and I quote, "Without data collection, without record keeping, without tracking, how can you effectively resolve one particular situation, and at the same time, how can you track what is working and what is not?" She thinks Bill 14 was the more superior piece of legislation. I found her to be quite compelling, and a number of those anti-bullying coalitions, I thought, wanted to look at this holistically. They wanted to tackle the effects of bullying head-on. They weren't really excited about the punitive measures for the bully or the perpetrator. What they wanted instead was to find a way to make it remedial. We had a couple great dynamic people also appear before committee I'd like to talk about briefly. Two of them, one I mentioned earlier was Anthony MacLeod, who appeared on the Premier's anti-bullying blog or his blog to talk about anti-bullying. I thought he had some salient points to mention, but also I'd like to talk about Stuart Schwartz. He is a constituent of mine from Nepean Carleton on Magic 100.3 FM in the morning. He's also the Ottawa Senator's PA announcer, and he spoke very eloquently about a number of things, most of which was to support, of course, Bill 14. But he makes a great point, Speaker, and this is where I think it's not just legislation that we need to affect. We have to have that mental attitude, all of us, throughout the entire province, where we're not going to accept or tolerate people bullying anyone. One of my friends, Colin McSweeney, often will say this: we need to be in a place in Ontario today where we were 20 years ago with drinking and driving, where we made it so taboo to talk about or do or discuss that it was the wrong thing to do and people shied away from doing it. It's a perfect deterrent. And that's part of the message, quote unquote, from Stu. No matter how bad you think it is, someone is there to help you. But as we keep hearing, the zero tolerance policy is not being followed in every school. I'm not sure if it's a lack of resources, but the problem is getting worse. Kids need to understand that their words can kill. And he further says, toward the end of his statement, quote, "This is where we need to take bullying. We need to educate kids to get them to a place where we don't even want to type something hateful online. We have a responsibility as parents, educators, and lawmakers to make the future safer for our parents." Now, I think everyone here wants to do that, Speaker. I think that we're going to get into a real dangerous game if we start to say, well, you know what, you don't support my bill, so you don't want to protect kids or something like that. I think, that's pretty illegitimate as an example of where we're at today. There are members on this side of the House, that side of the House, and over here in the NDP who all agree that we need to do something. I'm simply saying that because the way the process was created or followed, that it did not allow for people with legitimate concerns and experience in the bullying sphere to actually make deputations that would be followed. In fact, I think of my friend David Millen, who was one of the leading examples of anti-bullying advocates 10, 20 years ago in Ottawa-Gatineau, somebody who started the Child and Youth Friendly Ottawa, CAFO. It's a very well-known organization. In fact, the first time I ever met Dalton McGuinty, he was leader of the official opposition, and I was still working at the City of Ottawa, and we were at a CAFO Spirit of the Capital Awards because David Millen believed so much in youth. He was blocked from attending committee. He would have had a wonderful ability to provide us with his examples of how to protect children and what works and what doesn't. And I simply submit to you, with the parents that I've read into the record and those anti-bullying coalitions, that it just doesn't seem to be penetrating, and I'm not sure we're going to be any further ahead on September 1st as we were last December 1st. And that's what concerns me. But I further point out that I'm not alone. I talk about Anthony MacLeod, and let's talk about restorative practices again. He starts off by saying, "I think we're weaker when we're separated and we're stronger when we're together." In some of the schools that I go to, they do a practice called restorative justice, restorative practices. You might have heard of it. That is when an aggressor has been bothering somebody. The aggressor will sit down with the victim, and they'll sit down with their parents and the extended school community, and they'll talk. That's why, explicitly, my colleague and I put forward a motion, an amendment, to ensure that we would be talking about restorative practices. That motion was defeated, which was very disappointing. But that was where it came from. It was one of those first presenters in the first 2 days who came to committee to say, this is an opportunity for us to proceed, and this is how we should move ahead. Anyway, he also talked about the Wear Pink Day, and I know many members here were here when we made our statements on Wear Pink Day. So he was wearing pink that day, as was I actually, and he said, quote, "You might have heard what happened in Nova Scotia when a boy in grade 9 came to school one day, first day of school, wearing a pink shirt, and 2 grade 11 students started making fun of him and calling him all these homophobic names because he was wearing pink. They threatened him. They said, tomorrow, when you come to school, we're going to beat you up if you dress in pink. I can imagine if that was said to me, I probably would have deliberately worn pink. They threatened him. They said, the student goes home. He doesn't know what to do. He's really worried, really concerned. What he doesn't know is that 2 grade 12 students, David Shepard and Travis Price, heard this happen, and they said, no, not at our school. We're not going to put up with this. They got on Facebook, which is often blamed for cyberbullying, but it can be used for good. And they sent a message to all their friends on Facebook telling them what happened, saying, quote, tomorrow everybody wear pink. Guys, girls, everyone wear pink. They got their cell phones out and sent text messages like these guys are doing over here and said, hey, everybody wear pink. He says, this is good. If I was in school, man, you guys would get in trouble right now. Students aren't allowed to do that when I speak. I imagine somebody must have heckled them. I'm reading the heckling here. But the point is, they showed up the next day at school. A whole bunch of students wearing pink just like this guy. The ones that were not wearing pink, these 2 students would come up to them and say, hey, would you wear this pink shirt? And the students were like, why? They told the story about this kid in grade 9 who'd been bullied for wearing pink. One by one, people put the pink shirt on and they said, we want to make a school where you don't get signaled out for being different. It doesn't matter what color shirt you have. It doesn't matter what color skin you have. We are one school. We are one family. Would you wear pink? One by one, people said, yeah, I'll wear pink too. And it spread. Do you know what happened to those 2 kids that bullied the one kid? I don't know either. We never heard from him again. Then he finishes. I was actually really impressed with this presentation. The Ontario that I see doesn't put people in boxes. The Ontario that I see is united, and it begins with our kids. When I read Bill 14, I see inclusive language that will cover and protect all Ontario students. And that's why I support Bill 14. And by talking about inclusive language, my colleague and I further put forward resolutions that would have ensured that the Human Rights Code would have been followed and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms would have been followed. And we were told, no, they wouldn't support us. They suggested in some cases that that would be redundant. In other cases, of course, it wasn't, as long as they were putting forward the resolution. It really bothered us to the point that my colleague from Burlington was, not to tell a tale out of school, but you were quite emotional. This was your first experience in a committee, particularly through clause by clause, and I believe you probably came to this House the way I did. Quite idealistic, believing that we'll all try to get along. When we say we want to work together, it actually means we want to work together. It doesn't mean we're going to say we're going to work together, we're going to rip the guts out of your bill, and we're not going to take any of your amendments, and when it's time to actually support language that is inclusive for everybody, we're not going to follow it. So what's happened, Speaker? Well, we know, for example, 80% of the people who appeared before committee opposed the Liberal bill. We know that many people weren't able to appear before committee on both sides. We heard that loud and clear. We know that all of our amendments, with the exception of cyberbullying, were defeated. And we know that one minister of that government has already said that this fight is going to end up in the Supreme Court of Canada. It was on the front page of my newspaper, the Ottawa Citizen. And so now what's happened, and this is what frustrates me, and I think most of these parents completely, is the issue of bullying has now been relegated to some secondary issue as this government and the Catholic education system decide whether or not they're going to be funded or defunded as a result of one of the sections here. We find that quite troubling. We would have preferred to have something that was stealth, that would withstand the test of time, and as some of my colleagues said earlier, in many debates, would affect all children. I remember at committee, another one of these wonderful deputations that were ignored, listening to Alan Hubley, who said that he would prefer we fix the language so that we could get anti-bullying legislation in place that would actually affect all children and wouldn't withstand the threat of a lawsuit. And now we've got these implications. And now, at one point, actually, when we were going through clause by clause, there were probably a scrum or two a day to talk about the implications of Bill 13. Now, it's one way to go about it. I proposed 2 others. I proposed 2 others, and at the time I had said very clearly we could have gone early to try and meddle this out like adults. We chose not to do that. My colleague from Whitby, Oshawa, was there and spoke eloquently around that table in the Government House Leader's office, asking, and as we tried to persuade them to do the right thing. The second option, I think, came as a result of, I'll be quite frank, I'm a member of the Legislative Assembly Committee, and I spent a lot of time with the clerk and the deputy clerk learning about the standing orders and things that they used to do in terms of best practices around this chamber during minority parliaments. And one of those effective ways to deal with a social problem or an economic problem is you actually appoint one of the policy stream committees to deal with a study of the issue, then recommendations, and potentially a piece of legislation. Those are 2 options we could have pursued, and I don't think people would have felt so out of the loop, so ignored, so disaffected. I think that we could have done better. However, we're where we're at, and I think that there's now an agreement between two of the parties here, and our party has decided, we're going to vote against this legislation. We're going to keep Bill 14, which is now Bill 80, on the order paper, and we're going to continue to have public consultations on our own to make sure that every voice is heard. But that does not stop all of us in this chamber from ensuring that we do have a tone in our debate that does inform all young people throughout Ontario that bullying is unacceptable. We all have a role to play in making sure that the positive aspects of this debate continue to get out. And that means kids shouldn't be bullied based on how they look, based on where they live, based on what their parents do, based on whether they're gay or straight. They shouldn't be bullied based on their ethnicity. And it's up to us in this chamber and to other community leaders to ensure that we continue to have that discussion. It's up to us to make sure that we make bullying taboo, that it's recognized early on as behavior that is unacceptable in our province, and in particular, in our schools. Speaker, this has been a very long and emotional debate for so many Ontarians. I don't doubt for one moment that this has been a long and emotional debate for members of this Assembly. In particular, I would again like to thank a few people, but they're probably the same people, but I want to tell you why, not just from social policy. But from my chair, I've stood here and I've heard stories of how bullying has affected members here. I had one member from another party who I'm quite fond of tell me that they thought bullying was a normal way of life. We got to fix that. We've had mums talked about their kids. We've had grandparents talk about their experiences. We've had a lot of strength here and a lot of emotion. And just because we disagree on a few items doesn't mean that we can't set the level of debate to be a positive one. I know that it troubles all of us that there have been divisions, and that's why I think many of us have tried very hard to be calm, representative, and progressive. But I'll point out something. I've mentioned it a few times. I grew up in Glasgow, Nova Scotia, and you treated your neighbor like they were your family because God knows they were at your house enough. Our community went through a lot of hard times. And you were always supposed to look after your buddy, your neighbor. And I don't remember bullying being the way it is. It just, maybe it was a small town. Maybe some people would say it's worse there. But I learned long ago that you don't necessarily need to accept another person's point of view. You need to respect it. And I will tell you, Speaker, that I'm happy to respect my colleague's point of view, but I don't agree with it. And I'll continue to stand up for the people I brought into this chamber today. I'll continue to work on this file with a keen interest as education critic. And I know that there's other members in this assembly and some of us who have had agreements on maybe process-related issues that could be tinkered with in the future if this ever comes up again. But all in all, here we are, almost at an end of a school year, and certainly almost at the end of this legislative session. And time has come that this bill be put to a vote. So, to all of the Ontarians who have expressed their opinion, on the right or the left or simply in between, I want to say thank you. And to the parents, the brave ones, who came forward to recount their stories, I'll forever be grateful that they shared that, and I'll never forget them. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.